Oh, great, we're great. All right, thanks everybody. Our apologies for that minimal delay, but 3 cheers for Clara for sorting out our technical difficulties. So first of all, thank you so much everyone for coming here this afternoon. It's great to see you all. And we'd also like very much to thank St. Paul's Church for providing the venue for today's presentation by our guest, Mr. Harold Madi. And his presentation will be on Charlottetown, city building for the 21st century. As indicated in the notice as well, admission has been free. However, donations can be made to St. Paul's local social outreach program. Harold is an award-winning urban planner with a degree in architecture, a teacher, an author, and has been a member of several urban design award and design review panels. Harold has extensive experience and recognition internationally, nationally, and within Atlantic Canada, having led award-winning projects in Halifax, Fredericton, Moncton, and Dartmouth. Harold also led and was a principal author of Charlottetown's 500-lot area development standards and design guideline report, and its official plan and zoning review, which was held in 2013. With that, I'd like to hand this microphone and the screens over to Harold to share some of the exciting new trends and strategies today that cities are using today to plan for and address the challenges and opportunities of tomorrow. So with that, off to Harold.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. My mic's working. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to be back in Charlottetown after almost 10 years since I was last here to prepare as Andrea noted, the 500-lot area study, as well as the comprehensive review of the official plan and zoning bylaw. It happens that every 5 to 10 years, the city reviews its official plan, and this is a really timely presentation in that the city is about to launch its strategic vision and official plan review process. And this is a time when, once in a generation, the city consults with the residents and undertakes a significant background review. It's a bit of a retrospective, looking back at how things have changed in the city, what works, what doesn't work, what is needed, what's in demand, what is the aspirations of the city. And this sets up the new long-term vision in the official plan for the next 20, 25 years. So you're just beginning that process. I'm not the consultant hired to do it. There is a consultant that has now been selected, probably a team of consultants that will be assisting. I know their work, it's very good. So I'm really quite excited to see what the outcomes of that official plan are going to be. You'll probably be reached out to consult with on various aspects of that official plan process. And so this seems like a really good kickoff, so to speak, to that process. It's very high level. It's going to talk about some of the big kind of changes and shifts going on in the world and how that kind of makes an impact on the way we build cities or shape our cities. It's by no means a full, complete list of things. It's just touching on some things, and I've tried to tailor it for Charlottetown specifically. And I'm hoping that it might trigger some interest and maybe some conversation afterwards. How much time do we have for the... Okay, so we have 2 for... Okay. So I'll probably talk about 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we can maybe have some conversation afterwards. And maybe you might have some questions, and that might touch on some things that maybe I would have liked to have presented, but just didn't get around to doing it. So it's fresh off the press. I literally have been working on this right until the minute I was picked up. Well, the door was banged on, and I was picked up to get over here. I had lost track of time. So I'm just going to lay out what I'm going to speak about. 4 sections. The first, and I've tried to keep this concise by just keeping it to 5 key things. What are the key drivers of change going on in the city? And this shouldn't come as a big surprise to you, but just to focus a bit on some of the big changes going on, the shifts going on that are driving change, and those then result in what I call the 5 key themes reshaping cities. So we have these big shifts going on economically, environmentally, etc. Those result in some themes in terms of how cities are changing and reflecting and responding to those big shifts. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some key principles, specifically a new agenda for the 21st century in terms of how we need to think about cities and how we plan our cities moving forward to reflect a kind of new, both a new way of thinking, but also kind of reflecting back on some of the enduring ways that we build cities and that we've kind of lost touch with some of the important things that are very important in terms of how we build cities. And I think that that will be not, it shouldn't be anything that's radical, but it might result in some nods because it just makes a lot of sense. Number 4, I've just some 5 big ideas for Charlottetown. Just off the top of my head, I just thought to keep aligned with some of the discussion in the presentation, but also just to think about some bold ideas. It might be controversial. Some of it might be a little bit out of this world from some perspectives, but I really believe that it's conceivable and possible in some form or another. So let's have a look at the 5 key drivers for change in the cities. So just as a sum up for the 5 key drivers, I've coined them in these terms: the race to resilience, everything disrupted, massive urban shift, revival of the commons, and it's about experience. Those are the kind of 5 key drivers that I've identified that I'm going to speak about. When we talk about race to resilience, you probably hear a lot about resilience, planning for resilience, and trying to make sure that our cities are resilient. We're primarily talking in this day and age about climate change and how cities are equipped and responding to what is emerging as the irony, of course, is that we have been for many years trying to minimize our impact on the climate, but now it's come to a point where we're now in a climate emergency, we call it. We have made such a footprint and such an impact on our environment that we are now both trying to minimize our impact on the environment and trying to contend with the environment's impact on us, because it's gotten to a point where, of course, we are experiencing floods that were once every 100 years, happening every 10 years. Fires are now happening every year. It's the same old, it's like a Groundhog Day over and over again. Every year we're beginning to see the exact same pattern: drought, fires, floods, and large events, whether it's wind, tornadoes, or hurricanes that are not only happening in greater frequency, but are happening in far greater with far greater impact and with greater devastation. So these are the things that we need to obviously continue to minimize our impact on the climate, and we have to also prepare. In this area, of course, you probably have heard of sea level rise. PEI is very much a place like much of Atlantic Canada that is susceptible to the sea level rise. There is some predictions that PEI is going to become 3 islands within our lifetimes, and as that sea level rises. The big issue, of course, with that in the immediate term is the surge, the surge with respect to the tidal surge, which during storms it gets higher and higher, and of course the frequency of flooding is a big issue. So this is a big issue that cities have to contend with, and there's a variety of different ways in which municipalities are trying to deal with this, but the impacts on the environment is something that is resulting in a significant concern and great deal of cost for many cities. And it's, of course, something that not only cities but provinces and the federal government has to contend with as well. When I talk about everything disrupted, it's kind of a catch-all for really countless number of things. COVID, of course, and the pandemic was a huge disruption, and it had its own consequences with respect to city building. All of a sudden, we realized that our public realm, regardless of how big and adequate we might have thought and what measures and standards we used in the past, all of a sudden it wasn't enough. Because if we had to keep 1 to 2 meters apart, all of a sudden your sidewalks needed to be of significantly wider. All of a sudden we were thinking about outdoor space and the use of outdoor space in different ways. Restaurants were now spilling out and patios were extending their seasons to try and maintain their business and provide seating. It had some really great consequences. It was disruptive, but in some cases it actually led to some really interesting ways in which we're dealing with the public realm. So there's obviously some good things that came out of that after the period of adjustment. Other forms of disruption include the technology and the way in which artificial intelligence, for example, or data collection. Some of it is contentious. We can't walk out the door without being on camera in some form or another. We don't know, or sometimes are aware or aren't even aware of where all these cameras are, but there's security cameras and other forms of surveillance that exist that is also a reality of our cities today. Technology, of course, is influencing a lot of other things that we are only beginning to understand. Everything from deliveries by drones to autonomous vehicles where they'll be self-driving. These are already being tested, and really just within our lifetime we'll begin to see these things roll out. Of course, it won't happen. It won't be cataclysmic in terms of change. It's going to be evolution, more like a evolutionary. Not everyone's going to have an autonomous vehicle, but autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, are going to change a lot of the ways in which we store cars. For example, we won't need to be parking cars. They will be continuously moving. If we have shared autonomous vehicles, it means things like transit becomes far more cheaper and affordable to provide in contexts like this. Providing transit when you don't have a lot of ridership is expensive. The labor costs are particularly expensive. But if the vehicles aren't being driven by individuals and just simply moving on a circuit, they become far more affordable to be provided. So, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of some of the implications of technology. Another thing about disruption, I've talked about COVID and that public health issue, but society, in particular Canadian society, is of course, we are very much a country welcoming to immigrants. And immigrants have an impact, of course, on our cities and where they decide to live and choose to live. Demographics, in terms of how we are becoming a more aged and older society, and the needs and desires of an aged population, public health needs, but also simple things as, for example, sidewalks, the width of sidewalks, making sure that they're accessible and easy to, that the curbs aren't too high, for example, that there's ramps where they need to be, that there aren't too many steps. All of these things become things that we need to think about when it comes to a society that is more challenged in terms of how they move about. The diversifying households, our families have changed. We don't have the same mother, father, 2 kids and a dog type of family anymore. We have that plus many more different types of family household types. And they have different housing needs, and we need to be responsive to that. And having a diverse tenure and housing types in any neighborhood becomes a very important need that we need to provide as planners. When I talk about massive urban shift, it's responding to or describing this what has now been a couple of decades of a shift going on of what we call reverse migration. There's what was once a kind of a suburbanization of cities is now kind of there's a counter force going on. Millennials in particular and younger generation, they have a very different attitude and a very different set of values than the generations before them. They're buying less cars. They are driving less. They're far more engaged with social media. They tend to prefer to. They don't want to own everything. They're happy to share bikes, happy to share cars, happy to be involved in a kind of shared economy. They have different set of values, and it has huge implications on the economy and and also on the ways, on the places that we live. They tend to want to live in more urban contexts. They want to be able to walk to amenities and services, and they've been real drivers behind what has been this kind of urban renaissance, we call it. A lot of. It's not just about downtowns. It's kind of a shift to more walkable places. They want to be in places that are more mixed use, a little bit denser, closer to their friends. They have no qualms about living in apartments. They're less interested necessarily in having backyards and private spaces that they need to upkeep and maintain. They are more travel. They like to travel. They spend their money in different ways, and that's having a huge implication on cities as well. So there's a number of different inputs into this kind of return to traditional urban places. In larger cities, congestion and the hours people spend in commuting is not a choice that millennials especially want. That's one of the reasons why they're moving to more urban areas, so they can avoid a life burdened with that type of lifestyle of having to travel every day in and out of the city for an hour to 2 hours. Costs have implications on it. There are also policies that are now in place that are trying to counter the sprawl that's taking place on the edge of the periphery of cities. And I talked about demographics and, of course, the culture and market shifts, which is specific to the millennial. I'm trying to minimize examples of Toronto, but Toronto is, and it's not because I'm from Toronto, but Toronto is actually one of the fastest growing city in North America, certainly between the States and Canada. And it's a Canadian city, but it's one that is actually on the forefront or on the battlefront of urban regeneration in magnitude and scale, really that's unprecedented for a first world city, certainly for a Canadian city. It's growing almost at 100,000 people a year. I mean, that's about the size of PEI every year. So, and that's just the city. And there's some really these kind of drivers that I'm talking about. They're almost amplified in Toronto. You see them in a really large scale. You can really notice those patterns that I'm speaking about. And the downtown and the growth of the downtown is just to show you in a hyper form, just the scale of change that's going on and how rapidly it's going on. This is just showing you a graph showing you the growth that's happening. In the dark blue right in the middle is the downtown, the growth of the downtown occurring over the course of several years. And what you see at the top in the green is not just Toronto, but the whole GTA, which includes the suburban areas, which is where much of the growth has occurred for the last few decades. And as you can see, in the last 10 to 15 years, the downtown has completely surpassed the entire GTA in terms of its growth rate, and the city of Toronto itself, the city proper, is also on an uptick as well. So these are places. The city of Toronto has been built out. There's no vacant land. There hasn't been for 2 decades. Where is that growth going? It's all going internally. It's going into regeneration areas. It's going into intensification and infill. All of that growth is being accommodated within the city, within the built-up areas, not on greenfield land. So clearly, that's a very different way in which we build cities. It's a completely different focus with a completely different set of complexities and a completely different set of considerations. Just as an image, just to show you, in the course of 14 or 15 years, just the difference. This is a visual just to show you what in 2002 Toronto's central area looked like, and by 2016, what the number of buildings, the amount of buildings that have been approved, not just built, but approved. Some of these haven't been built yet, but they're under construction. In the course of that small period of time, the downtown has actually doubled in size. That's a huge, significant growth. They call it the Manhattanization of the city, but this is just a hyper example of what's going on in a smaller scale in other cities, but in all cities, for the most part, there has been a reverse migration. As you all know, in Charlottetown, there has been some pressures for development here as well. There is a demand for people who want to live in this place. It's walkable, it's mixed use, it has all of the same qualities as downtown Toronto, but on a smaller scale. Outside of Toronto, all of the areas that are growing rapidly are also not the suburban areas, but beyond suburban areas. And this is why we understand this to be not just about a downtown Toronto thing, but actually about anything related to walkability, mixed use, and compact urban form. All of the older cities and towns that have been there for 100 plus years, Guelph, I don't know if you know, if you've been to some of these places in Southern Ontario, but Guelph, Hamilton, Waterloo, Kitchener, all of these cities that are about an hour or an hour and a half drive from Toronto, they're booming because they have those old walkable streets and those mixed use, and they're more affordable. People can't afford to live. If you can't afford to live in downtown Toronto, the choice of the market isn't to go into the burbs. It's to go find something similar but cheaper. And so they're willing to go to places like Hamilton, pick up and start a new life again. So they're booming. These towns that were once secondary cities, not some of them as big as Charlottetown or a bit slightly bigger, are all going through a boom right now because of the qualities of the characteristics of the central area. Another driver is this kind of revival of the commons, I've called it. And this relates to, as I said, the kind of generational tastes and lifestyle tastes. There's been, on one hand, a kind of an embracing or a celebrating of more of a shared economy and more of a shared environment, but also because of the denser environment in which these people are choosing to live, they're exchanging what would have been private space, like a nice, generous backyard, and for a higher expectation in a shared space that is of higher quality. So, if I'm going to give up the backyard and the advantage of a backyard and my own private space, my expectation is that the shared amenities that we'll have will be of higher quality, one that I individually couldn't afford to possibly have on my own. So the public realm, meaning the streetscapes, the parks, the things that we share in a city, there is a higher expectation of the quality of these places to be, because people are, this is the only space that people have to enjoy in the city, and except for maybe a balcony or some other deck that might be a little bit of a more modest scale. So you can go to any major park or even in small scale parks in the cities across North America, and they're really well used, and they're becoming more so well used. We're experiencing a significant, especially in the summer months as it starts to get warmer, there's actually deficiency of park space in the cities, because our suburban areas have benefited greatly from the park levies and the kind of the money investment in grand, big, generous park spaces in the suburban areas, because there wasn't a lot of people living downtown. There wasn't a big need for the parks, so that's kind of where it went. So there has to be a kind of a revisiting of the formulas that we've used in cities for park space. So everything from streets to parks and other ways in which we use public spaces is becoming very important, and how we deal with that. It's about the experience. The fifth one, the last driver shaping cities, is one about this kind of shift towards, and this again millennially driven. In large part because of our access to social media and the internet, and being able to see the world really on our screens, and the allure of that. We're far more well-traveled. Our expectations in terms of quality have been raised, and what people are looking for is authenticity. They're looking for real experiences. They aren't willing to there isn't as much of a desire, or they might visit it once, but they're really looking for real places, real living, breathing places. Not museums, not kind of static cities, but places that are vibrant and changing, evolving constantly, and ones that are that are offering something different and new all the time. And so that's why there's a big draw, of course, to the big cities that we've all been to, Paris and London and New York. But there are also smaller places that are offering the same kind of a quality of vibrant culture. And it's the cities that I mentioned before, where there's been this kind of resurgence and renaissance, like Kitchener and Hamilton, that were, Steeltown is Hamilton. It was a blue collar predominantly, but there has been a huge cultural revival happening, and a lot of secondary cities are benefiting greatly from the affordability issues of the big cities. So there's been a kind of shift of young, creative folks that are taking residence in some of these secondary cities in beautiful character homes. They're investing in renovating these homes, and they're actually adding to the vibrancy of the streets and neighborhoods that they're moving into. And they themselves are starting businesses, and they're kind of small startups, and they are creating a cultural kind of renaissance that's going on that is making these places attractive to visit, not just to live. So there's this real kind of push for experience in how we think about cities and the places that we live. And that's why we see big box stores, and they call them lifestyle centers, these commercial places on the edge of town, which were usually just boxes before. We can call them big boxes, that's what we call them. But they're trying harder and harder to appeal to what the market shifts are. They're trying to look a little bit like Main Street. The architecture is changing, and they're trying to add a little bit more landscaping, trying to look more like a lifestyle center is what they're calling them now. So they have somewhat of the qualities of, for example, of an urban center, but they still, of course, are predominantly automobile oriented. So and this is kind of the contradictions that exist in our society today. We want to keep our downtowns, we love our downtowns and our main streets, but we just can't give up the car, which is clogging and congesting our streets at the same time. So I've been taking a little informal poll in Charlottetown. If I've talked to anybody new, I will ask them if they drove to whoever it was that I met them, and they would say yes. And I said, how far about do you live? I said, well, it's embarrassingly, they say about a block away or 2 blocks away. So it's too easy to get into the car here and move about, and of course that has other consequences, not just for the downtown, but also for our health and our sedentary lifestyles is really killing us, and we need to get ourselves out on the street and on our foot, moving about a bit more as evolution has designed us to be. So 5 key themes reshaping cities. So that talked about some of the drivers, big broad strokes. So how does that translate in terms of themes actually shaping the way cities are changing? And I've again organized that under five categories. This whole urban-suburban regeneration. I mentioned how Toronto isn't expanding anymore in terms of sprawl. Predominantly, the growth is happening internally, and this is what we call urban regeneration. And it's happening not just in the old city, it's happening in the suburban areas now as well. In large part because the province in Ontario is forcing the suburban municipalities to do it. They would rather not, but for the purposes of sustainability and for a better, efficient use of taxpayer money, we've got to think about how we allocate our resources more efficiently. The second one is about complete communities. I'm sure you've heard this term, and it's actually being repackaged constantly. You might have heard of the 10-minute or 5-minute city, or a 5-minute neighborhood, or 20-minute neighborhood, lifelong communities, mixed use. All of these actually are describing very similar things, which is what I've kept under the heading of complete communities, and it's actually becoming a very important vision in most official plans. The third is about reclaiming the streets. There is, reclaiming the streets is a protest movement that began in England, but it's really expanded and has become kind of a multi-pronged and it's less about protest and more about better utilizing our streets for more than just automobiles. And the fourth is creative spacing. I mentioned how parks and open spaces are a real premium, and there's deficiencies of them, particularly in our urban areas, where we're getting a lot more creative on how we actually find and utilize public space. I'm going to talk a little bit about this notion of creative spacing. And lastly, going green and getting smart. Smart cities is something you might have heard of. Green infrastructure and how cities are becoming more sustainable are obviously all very important factors and themes. So, regeneration. There's many ways in which one might define regeneration. There's retrofitting, infill, intensification, reurbanization, revitalization. All of these terms aren't exactly the same, but they're part of they're under this umbrella of a term called urban regeneration. And this is something that's happening in suburban contexts as well, as I mentioned. In a lot of ways, the opportunity in urban regeneration is not just about the wholesale demolition of things and rebuilding them. What we're getting really good at is finding ways in which we're better utilizing the space and land between buildings. And where there's heritage involved, we're integrating heritage. We're basically layering the city in many ways. And if there is a wholesale demolition, in most cases it's because it's something that really is underutilized, or for example, it might have been an old dilapidated industrial building, or something that really isn't worthwhile in keeping. So it depends on what it is. But the opportunity, of course, is not only in intensifying and adding population to better utilize our infrastructure so that we're growing more sustainably, but there's also opportunities with regeneration to repair parts of the city that maybe have been that were built in a less desirable way, and this investment gives us an opportunity to correct things. It's an opportunity to revive main streets that have died off because there's been a depopulation. Now this is a repopulation. We're seeing this especially in Atlantic Canada and in smaller cities, is that, for example, in Halifax, because I know it well, Gottingen is a street that you might know, familiar with if you've been to Halifax. Gottingen, that whole part of the North End, that was a vibrant main street that served a significant population. But the peninsula had lost so many people over several generations that infrastructure, that critical mass of stores and services that were servicing that neighborhood died off because the volume wasn't there. There wasn't the critical mass of people and population to maintain those stores open. The 500 lot area also had a significant depopulation of people. Although all the houses might be occupied, they aren't occupied with the same size households as they were in the 20s and 10s at the turn of the last century. Families were much bigger. There were a lot more people that were living in the 500 lot area than there are today. And so the infrastructure like Queen Street and other places where there might have been far more commercial activity don't exist. They just can't survive. They depend a great deal on the tourism, the tourist traffic, for example, to survive. That tourism certainly wasn't there 60, 70 years ago. So just some examples. This is in Halifax, where the firm that I was with at the time, we also did a plan for the downtown, and very similar to Charlottetown. There was a lot of polarization between the heritage community and the development community. There was a lot of lack of clarity in the development approval process, and we helped to introduce that. And in Halifax, which had really fallen far behind other cities of a similar size in terms of revitalizing and seeing a downtown that was growing, it was actually quite the opposite. If you went to Barrington Street, the early 2000s, it was a pretty scary place. It wasn't at all what it is today. If you go back there today in Halifax, and you see what's happened to Barrington Street or Spring Road, It's really, really significantly changed. And there's some new spectacular modern architecture, and new buildings go up, and lots of cranes. There's a lot of activity. It's booming again, and it's one example of this kind of urban regeneration that's happening in the downtowns. And I showed you Toronto as on the other end of the spectrum, also as an example. There should be no downtown in North America that isn't experiencing development pressures and revitalization. In the burbs, we're seeing what were once malls and strip roads that are being transformed into urban centers themselves. Mixed uses, high-rise buildings. From Vancouver to Ontario, there's a significant amount of population, and these aren't small buildings. There are 50 to 60-story towers that are being built in these suburban areas, like Vaughan, and there's a huge amount of pressure and a big market for this type of living. So it's not just an urban thing; it's a suburban thing as well. And just to be clear, those developments are happening in conjunction in Vancouver and in Toronto and in other cities as well. All of it is happening in conjunction with transit. It's not happening on the backs of the road system. All these road systems in all major cities across North America are congested. There's no way in which we can expand the road network. It doesn't expand anymore. Something's got to give, and the only way that people are going to get about is by transit. That is the fastest way to get about. And so the growth that we're seeing is in transit. It has to do with transit stations and transit investment. So if you want to invest and you have some money, just follow the transit, is what I tell everybody. If you want to get a good return on your investment, then in real estate, find out where transit's being invested 20 years down the road. Put your money into some land and just wait, because it's going to. That is where the pressures and the significant opportunities exist in all major cities that are building transit. So the other thing, of course, is what we're seeing is not just in malls or centers, but also along strip streets, major arterial roads. We call them. They're not main streets; they're arterial roads. If there's transit going in, you can pretty much be certain that there's development following close behind. Former industrial areas are part of this urban regeneration. These are examples in Toronto and in Victoria, where there's what were once dilapidated old industrial areas are now becoming entirely new neighborhoods. Many of them are sustainable in their own right. And then if you think about the kind of small 1950s type plazas that exist in a lot of our suburban neighborhoods, those are becoming now opportunities to be redeveloped into community hubs. So in addition to the retail, they're introducing other types of housing, because it's not just single detached that we need in our neighborhoods. We also need a multitude of other types of housing to reflect the diversifying demographics and population. And in doing so, they're creating these really interesting, vibrant places that are really vibrant 24 hours a day, because there's people living there. It's not just a plaza anymore. It's not just a parking lot. It's actually a place it's like a little mini Main Street or downtown that serves this community. So they become really treasured places. But I can tell you, these communities don't want that change initially. It's not until it's actually built that they realize that it wasn't as bad as they thought it was. And in fact, it's added value and amenity and services to the community. Of course, we have to get the shape and scale right, and making sure that it doesn't detract from the character of the area, but it's a science and an art. Social housing projects. I don't know that Charlottetown has any significant social housing projects like they do in other cities, but they're reaching their shelf life. They were mostly built in the 50s. It's a kind of old, antiquated way in which we build social housing or affordable housing. And they were built in large-scale developments and communities. They're now reaching their shelf life, and rather than being renovated, and this is a really particular Canadian model, because the stigma associated with social housing isn't as bad as it is in the U.S., which is often tied to racial issues. And our social housing has a little bit is not as bad, and it's not as large scaled as it is in the U.S. And the markets here, the urban market is so robust and so healthy, that you can have market housing commanding very large prices right beside social housing, and it won't do a blip in the market. There isn't an impact. There isn't really any negative connotations associated with it. And because of that, we can tear down the social housing in Canada and rebuild it entirely. And this is a model that works quite well in Toronto and other major cities in Canada. We call it mixed income communities. Instead of just these stigmatized, segregated social housing projects, the idea is that you just integrate them into market housing. You can't identify which building or which unit is actually affordable housing. It's actually, or socially assisted housing. It's entirely integrated, and of course there's benefits to the dwellers of social housing if they're living amongst everyone else in the community, if they belong to the community, if they're included in the community. It's a source of pride, and many of those folks are able to get themselves out of the difficult situations that they're in because of that. There's an obvious benefit to being around other members of the community. So we're seeing these phenomenal transformation of social housing into these mixed income communities, particularly in urban areas. Tower and parks, certainly in Halifax, you see them less so here, but in the 70s and 80s in particular, we had tall buildings built on big, green, useless spaces that were not particularly attractive buildings, and often in suburban context. And what we're seeing now is this called retrofit. What would have been on the far left, you'll see tall buildings in this kind of wasteland of parking and green areas, which is supposed to be open space, but nobody uses that open space. And there's infill now taking place, and that infill is helping to revitalize these buildings. They, like the social housing, are reaching their shelf life. And so we call it tower renewal. And this renewal of towers is happening with a revenue source, which is infill. So yes, they're dense areas, but they're being infilled, if done correctly, with lower scale buildings. So rather than having one typology, it's actually mixing in other types of buildings, townhouses and other forms, to actually give these buildings street frontage. So when you're a pedestrian, you don't actually see the towers that much anymore. What you're seeing is the things right up front and center and in front of you on the street. So it's introducing retail stores, townhouses, and other forms of housing, and it's becoming a far more attractive community and a more diverse community as a result of this infill, this retrofitting. I talked about urban repair as part of this urban regeneration. Here, often seen, again, I bring up Halifax as an example, Cogswell interchange, which was once being built for an elevated highway that was never built in Halifax. And that was something that thankfully didn't happen. But these big engineering projects take up a lot of space. And in urban settings, and this is just to show you on the left, you'll see what was before. It was an intersection of 6 major streets, not highways, just streets. And they took up a lot of space because they had these on-ramps and off-ramps to take you to these bridges that were to try and minimize the number of intersections and keep the traffic flowing. Well, the thinking today is that it's okay to stop the traffic, to slow down the traffic. An intersection is a healthier way to integrate, where people live and work and play. And so these, what would have been city-owned land on these big parcels accommodating these road intersections are now being reconsidered and reconstituted into a grid of streets with infill and buildings. And this is happening. It's actually already happened in the West End, Etobicoke, which is a suburban area of Toronto. But we can see this happening in a lot of places in other cities as well. So a fine-grained, walkable street network. This is what I mean by urban, this notion of urban repair. And even in suburban areas where you've got your crescents and your cul-de-sacs and all those things going on, the arterial road is what would have been our main street in the way we used to build cities. being reconstituted. It's more complicated because it requires acquiring houses, and as opposed to just simply coming in and taking over a plaza or a mall and infilling in that respect. But it's a far more complex, costly, and long-term exercise. But the idea is to turn these single-use, homogeneous communities into something that includes a variety of housing, as well as shops and retail stores, maybe a bus stop, and other things that neighborhoods should have through kind of a series of kind of surgical interventions, if you want to call it that, new road links and other things that will help to make them more fine-grained and walkable. Complete communities is so that I spent a bit too much time on that. I'm going to move a little bit quickly. When I talked about complete communities already, this notion of 5 to 10 minute neighborhoods, or the whole idea here is that within walking distance, you should be able to complete the key major daily tasks in your life. So picking up a carton of milk, going to the dentist, going to your children going to school. Those things shouldn't be very long, grueling exercises in your daily life. They should be easy to do, pretty quick tasks. And we used to build our neighborhoods like that, and the notion is that we need to get back to that. We need to get back to a place in a time when you had the essential aspects of your neighborhood within reach, within a reasonable reach. And it depends where in the world, because this has been adopted now as a global movement. So in Europe, of course, you're seeing they're far more ambitious because they can be. They have far greater densities than we do, but they're talking about 5-minute neighborhoods where everything should be done in 5 minutes on foot. And that's the new measure of a good neighborhood. In North America, we've had to, of course, adjust that a little bit more. We're far more automobile-oriented. We just can't, with our densities, can't support those schools, those amenities, those services at the densities that we have in our cities. Our cities are far too low in density to support that. So we modified this and made it either the 10 or 20 minute, and we've included things like cycling, which gives us a bigger radius of movement to get to. So we're cheating a little bit, but at least we're trying to use active transportation on foot, on bike, and other forms. So I would say 5 minutes in Europe, but North American standard is probably more like 20 minutes. That within a 20-minute range of time, you should be able to have all the things that you need in the neighborhood. But that's not just about use, it's also about diversity of housing. So when we talk about lifelong communities, what we're talking about is if you, at different stages in your life, you have different housing needs. You might be a single person coming straight out of university. You might be a couple. You might be a couple with a kid now. You may be a full-fledged family with multiple kids, or you might be empty nesters and going into retirement. It's almost like a full circle, right? Your housing needs and the scale of the housing that you needs change. In terms of scale, it might change, but of course, when you're retired and you have a little bit more of a nest egg that you're sitting on, you might be able to afford something of higher quality, but you still don't need maybe as much space. So if you think about the range of housing that would respond to in terms of our different stage of life, our different access to income and the income levels that we might be holding at that different time of the year, at that different times of our lives. So if you're going to have that in one neighborhood, it's a significant diversity of housing that you need, right? So especially if you want to stay in your neighborhood, and why shouldn't you? If you're empty nesters or retiring and you don't need the big house that you have, why should you have to move to an entire new neighborhood to find a house that suits you? Why shouldn't we have the opportunity to live downscale and stay in our neighborhoods with our friends and our network of people that we know and all the things that we're familiar with? We used to build neighborhoods like that. You just simply shift on the next street or the next block and you would find what you needed that would suit your needs. I live in a neighborhood called Cabbagetown in Toronto, and in Cabbagetown, it was a poor Irish neighborhood, but it was messy. It didn't have, straight streets necessarily. It didn't have nice, houses all lined up and perfectly set up. It was a real mixed bag of things, and I don't think anybody in Charlottetown would want it any other way. We have a 4-story apartment building beside us. We have a row house, and then we have laneways. And in those laneways, there's houses actually addressing on those laneways. There's things that you'll discover and find that you didn't know existed there every time you take a walk. So it's part of the colorful aspects of that neighborhood. So there's a housing unit guaranteed for anybody in any life stage and any income level in my block alone. That's the diversity that exists there, and it's like we talk about the ecosystem and how diversity is important to the health of our ecosystem. It actually works the same way with cities. The more diversity you have, the more healthy a place is. And if you think about the places that we love to visit, they're really diverse places. They're places with extraordinary complexity and all of those things. And that's where authenticity comes from as well. So without talking much more, because I've already talked about what 20-minute neighborhood is, this is going to be available online, right, for people? So you're welcome to look at these slides in more detail. But this is just some examples and diagrams of what goes into a 20-minute neighborhood. One of the things that we also see in terms of how retrofitting or suburban areas, what about those neighborhoods that aren't 20-minute neighborhoods now? How do we make them 20-minute neighborhoods moving forward? Well, what we're doing is focusing a lot of effort in cities, most cities, like major cities in North America. Boston, for example, is a big leader in this, and also California, some cities, and Chicago especially, is our focus is on mid-rise buildings along major streets. And in doing so, you create enough density to support the services and retail that you need. And then just beyond those buildings are the neighborhoods, and they get access to what is becoming Main Street. They're Main Streets. So we're recreating Main Streets along these suburban corridors and introducing transit and retail shops, and all of the kind of diversity of housing that wasn't available in the neighborhood is being provided along, partly being provided along these corridors, mostly in mid-rise forms, so they fit better and they're more compatible with the low-rise context. Something else that's emerged is what we call the missing middle housing. We, in North America, stopped building everything between the semi-detached house and the high-rise apartment building. There used to be a time when we used to build a whole range of duplexes and multiplexes and garden and walk-ups. And if you go to any older part of the cities, certainly in this area, just in the 500 lot area, you'll see a huge diversity of housing types. But those housing types, they're not being built so much anymore if you go out into the suburban areas. You get a really monolithic typology of buildings. It's either detached, sometimes semi-detached, or you may get a townhouse complex, and then you go right into apartments, but you don't get the full range of the richness of housing that exists, and all of it is part of this transitional urban areas that we talk about, where things shouldn't be super tall and super low. It'd be better if things kind of transitioned and they kind of related a little bit more to one another, and that corresponded to parts of the city that were important, or major intersection or big streets. There's a hierarchy to the city that we need to reintroduce. And what we try to do in the 500 lot area is try to recapture that structure, or that urban structure, in the zoning bylaws. This is an example of how silly and outrageous we thought we were doing the right things at the time, but we assumed we are, yes, a car culture, but not everybody drives. Most of our children aren't of driving age; they can't drive, and then our grandparents, they're not necessarily driving either. So we've created communities where there isn't choices. So if you don't have a car, you're pretty much stuck, or you've got to put on your backpack and go for a hike if you don't have a car. And this is just two examples of, on the left, friends that live relatively close to each other, almost back-to-back backyards. And in this case, just across one row of houses, and then maybe a street is a school. But these are the routes that you'd have to walk to get to those places, because it's not, the grid has been completely thrown out the window, and we've in exchange for these crescents and these roads that meander, because they provide some seclusion. but they also limit us in many ways. They don't give us choices in terms of movement. They give us congestion, because what they do is funnel traffic from one road to a bigger road to a bigger road. So we call them local roads, collector roads, arterial roads. Right? You're actually funneling all the traffic into one point of access into the community, into the main roads. If you think about the 500 lot area, which is entirely a grid with multiple intersections and multiple choices, if something is held up or there's a fire or something that fire engines are taking up the road, you just turn at the first road intersection and you go around it. It's very easy to do. That grid is such a malleable grid is so malleable. It's so flexible. It's extremely versatile. You can build almost any type of function and use on it. It's something that is being revived in all of the new developments because of that. Okay, so move on a little faster here. Reclaiming the streets. Another, I talked about this other movement that's shaping our cities is that what has been for decades the preview of traffic engineers is our roads. Our streets are actually public domain. And in fact, it's the largest property in ownership of taxpayers. If you were to mount the land in acres or hectares of streets, it is the #1 top largest part of our ownership, our shared ownership as citizens of the city. But it's has been reduced from what was the public domain or public realm that had a multitude of purposes and uses and functions, has been really reduced to one thing: funneling traffic in many ways. And that entitlement that comes with it to traffic engineers, it means that they are reckless and careless in terms of how much space they take up for traffic. That to the point that, and I'll show some images. It's just remarkable in a place like 500 lot with a relatively older population, that you have sidewalks this big. You can't fit a wheelchair on them. You're tripping over them. The level of care, not only in the level of allocation of space, but even the level of care and maintenance is minimal relative to the automobile. And so it just does not make sense. It doesn't add up. It doesn't. When you think about the population using either of those, yes, there's a lot of car drivers, but do they need to have freeway-sized travel lanes on a street that's only going 40 or 50 kilometers an hour? Doesn't make sense. So there's space that could be better allocated. And when we talk about reclaiming streets, that's just one aspect of it. There's a whole shift and movement going on, not only in terms of rethinking our streets and their purpose of the streets and how they can be better utilized for a multitude of purposes, but there's also huge counter movements going on. Like when we talk about things like Vision Zero, someone has finally raised the alarm about the number of pedestrians that die every year, traffic fatalities, just crossing the intersection, or particularly in areas where it's not that automobiles are seeking out people to kill. It's just that pedestrians are less expected in certain environments. Cyclists, particularly I think in Charlottetown, and it's amazing how there's any cyclists at all, because it's just not it's not a safe environment for most people to be. I certainly wouldn't want my children to be riding their bikes on the streets here. So there's a need to rethink the safety issues. I mentioned how the width of the travel lanes is an issue. Road diets, we call them road diets. Our roads need to get on diets again. All of this helps to slow traffic down and to minimize fatalities. And what we see emerging, of course, less so here, but in other cities, is what we call micro-mobility. It's not just about bicycles anymore. There's scooters now out there. There's mopeds. There's a multitude of things. There's those what they call the single-wheel things. There's a whole variety of technologies out there, and there's more and more coming out. And we call it micro-mobility now because it's a catch-all term for all of these things that are emerging in our streets. An interesting quote. So I'll let you read that. But public transit has a stigma, and really in certain cities, the people don't second guess using public transit. It just makes a lot more sense. I don't I use my bicycle not because I'm a hippie, not because I'm looking for any health benefits. It's because it's the most convenient and fastest way for me to get to where I need to get to, far faster than the car in my neighborhood. It's just simple, it's just rational thinking. So in bigger cities, it's not even a question. It's not, we will, but I have a choice. I have a car, I have a bicycle, I have access to transit, I have an electric bike as well. I will choose what mode of movement that I want to use because my neighborhood, my city enables me to do it. And on the day of the week, if there's extra congestion, what the weather's like, I will make a choice. I have a choice. That's great. I can walk as well. So at the end of the day, do you have a choice? Does your neighborhood give you choices? And that's the important question to ask. The millions of dollars that walking saves just in health benefits, with heart disease, diabetes, all these. It's not about going to the gym. You just need to walk every day a little bit, and the health benefits are extraordinary. And they've actually did research on the different types of neighborhoods and the types of neighborhoods, from the walkable to the car dependent, and the costs in millions of dollars the cost burden to the public expenditures in terms of health costs, and they're extraordinarily the discrepancy is huge. So something that we're talking about a lot these days is what we call complete streets. How do we balance all users in the street in a fair way? And that will vary from street to street to street. This is to give you an example. What we used to talk in, traffic engineers talk about moving vehicles. Ultimately, when we're moving anything or transportation, we're actually moving people. And you have to remember that. And if you think about moving people, then it completely turns the formulas on their head. If we want to move people